Hi, boys and girls. It's time for another Grandma Sheilla story. Our story today is a mission story. It is called The Strange Guests. Missionary Halliwell and his wife and their 2 children had recently moved to the country of Brazil. They were going to be missionaries there. And their great dream was to go up and down that huge Amazon River, telling the people about Jesus and helping make the people that lived in those little villages well. Mrs. Halliwell was a nurse, and she thought that she could go from village to village, helping the people that didn't have a doctor to go to or a hospital to make them well. When they first moved to Brazil, they lived in a small house right along the river. And one of their biggest dreams had been to make a launch, which is like a boat, that they could go in up and down that river so they would have transportation and not have to go through the jungles. Well, that was what the missionary had been working on for weeks and weeks and weeks. He worked on building a very small launch, but an adequate launch that his family could live in. They could have a clinic and they could tell the people about Jesus from it. Well, the launch was finally completed. And the missionary had to think of a name for it. Finally, he named it Luzerio. In Portuguese, that meant a bright light, which made a lot of sense. That's what they hoped it would be, a bright light to all those people up and down the Amazon River. Well, the missionary, he had gotten into that launch, and he had started the motor, and he had gone up and down short distances up and down that river. The motor sounded good. The boat seemed to be balanced nice. Everything seemed to be good. Well, while he had been busy building that launch, his wife had been busy going through everything in that little house. Now, they would keep their little house, but it would just be locked up waiting for them to come back home. So she went through everything in the kitchen. Can you imagine trying to pack a tiny little boat for a family of 4 to live on for months at a time? Well, she was very careful, and finally she'd sorted out everything. This was the things she would take. These things would be packed away. Those things would be given away. And then they started making trips back and forth into that boat, the Luzario. They packed everything away. They made up the tiny little beds in it. Everything was ready. They stocked it with food, everything they thought they would need for everyday life and for emergencies, things to work on the boat if they had to. Well, that night, because everything they had pretty much was inside that boat, the missionary, he hired a young man to stand watch over the boat. Wouldn't it be terrible if somebody took their boat the first day? That night passed uneventfully. When they got up in the morning, the kids were so excited. This was an adventure they were going to go on. But before they went, the missionary said, "We're going to have worship. We want to ask God to bless our endeavors to tell the people on the Amazon about Him. And we want to ask for His protection and His guidance." And he read some verses in the Psalms about the ships that go out to sea. And he thought, well, that's kind of like us. We need God with us. Now, boys and girls, can you trust God to look ahead to what's going to happen in your life and take care of you? I hope so. Well, the Hollywells, they got on board that boat. They waved to the people from the village where they lived, and they set out down the river. Well, as they were going, both Mrs. Hollywell and her husband, the missionary, they were thinking about the dangers of this travel. Yes, dangers. There were snakes, there was wild animals, there were logs and rocks in the river. There were bandits that might try to take their little boat. There was mosquitoes that could give them terrible diseases. But neither of them mentioned those things because they knew those dangers were there. But they knew that they had a God that could take care of them. Well, as they were traveling along, the missionary, he was guiding that boat down the river, and suddenly he looked up, and there, not too far from their boat, was a canoe with 3 very rugged-looking men in it. He thought, uh-oh, let's hope that somebody doesn't take our boat on the first day we're out. But yet, missionaries, that's the reason why they're there. Well, he saw one of those men take a white shirt and he was flagging it up and down at that boat. And the missionary thought, missionaries are here to do acts of kindness. So he slowly stopped that boat. And those 3 men in the canoe, they rowed up until they were right beside that boat. They looked up at the missionary and they said, "We have a long ways to go down the river. Could we tie our canoe onto the back of your boat and ride along with you? It wouldn't be very far in your boat, but it would take us a long time to row. Please, could you help us, sir?" Well, missionaries, that's their job to help people. And the missionary, he looked at his wife and he could see the look on her face of, oh my, they didn't look like very savory characters. But the missionary, he tried to stall a little bit. He said, well, what village do you want to go to? How far do you want to go? And they said, oh, not too far, just down the river a little ways. Finally, he couldn't stall anymore. So he had the missionary had those 3 men crawl up over the side. He helped them get into the boat, and they tied the canoe onto the back of the boat. Well, when they got inside, these 3 men started wandering around the top of the boat. They went into where the missionary was guiding that boat, and they said, nice boat you got here. And the missionary, he thought, oh, I hope they don't plan on taking our boat. But then he scolded himself inside. Now, it's your job to be kind to people. Leave God to take care of what happens. So they went down that Amazon River. Well, they hadn't gone too far when one of those grisly-looking men came up behind the missionary, and he said, there's rocks up ahead. See the rocks in the river? Well, the missionary, he looked. He squinted, he looked down there. He didn't see any rocks. Um, I don't see any rocks, sir. Guy said, there's rocks, and if you hit them with your boat, that'll be the end of you. Get out of the way now and let me drive the boat. The missionary thought, oh no, this is it. They're going to take over the boat. But there was nothing he could do. He and his wife and children wouldn't be strong enough to overpower 3 big men. So he moved out of the way, and the man took a hold of that wheel that made the boat go nice and even in the water. Suddenly, in front of them, the missionary did see rocks. They were big rocks, but they weren't very far out of the river, just a little ways out above the water. And he noticed that big man carefully drove the boat around each of those rocks. Then there were more rocks. He drove around them and more rocks. The missionary thought, how would I have ever gotten around all those rocks? I didn't even know they were there. He turned to that man that was driving the boat and he said, thank you so much. I didn't even know there were any rocks there. Thank you for helping us. And the man, he looked at the missionary and he said, you can drive now. There's no more rocks for a long ways. And so the missionary went back to making that big ship's wheel guide down the river. They hadn't gone very far when those 3 men came up to the missionary and they said, this is where we want to get off. Well, the missionary, he looked around. There were no villages there. There was not even any little huts. It was just jungle bush around them. And the missionary said, really, I can take you to your destination wherever you want to go. The men said, no, we need to get out here. We want to get out here. The missionary didn't understand this, but he pulled a little ways over in that river, and he stopped. And those men untied their canoe. They got in. And when they were in their canoe and starting to row away, the missionary looked over at his 2 kids, and he said, you children, watch those men and tell me where they go. Well, the missionary in his heart was thanking Jesus for protecting them. And Jesus had not only protected them from those men that they were frightened of, but he had protected them from the rocks in the river, bringing these men that knew where the rocks were. Well, as he was driving that boat down the river, those 2 children said, Daddy, Daddy. And the missionary, he turned around and they said, Daddy, the canoe was right there. It was right there. And now it's gone. We didn't take our eyes off of it, but it's gone. Right there, on the deck of that launch, the missionary knelt down and thanked God for sending help to them. He would never know. Were those just some rough men that lived there along the river that knew where the rocks were? Or had they really been angels that had ridden in their canoe and disappeared back to do God's bidding? You know, the Lucerio did get to go up and down the Amazon River and healed lots of people and told lots of people about Jesus. And every time they went out, they remembered that first voyage when they knew for sure that God was going to take care of them wherever they were. And God will take care of you. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.